Virginia Woolf famously posited that Anne, who wrote so many poems without signing them, was often a woman. Catherine Parr, the sixth wife of King Henry VIII, wrote and published works during the 16th century in her own name. Of course, she was a queen, and the main theme for publications of the time were devotion, meaning publications surrounding a devotion to religion and faith. And when the printing press was invented, many widows entered the profession and were allowed to print books. They learned the trade from their fathers or their husbands. And by the 15th century, 10% of them were women-run or women-owned, but the content wasn't theirs. We can cite a few very early 14th to 17th century English women who wrote and published religious or pre-feminist texts under their own names. These were women at the forefront of religious reform and changing the narratives on the status of women. However, as you can imagine, their works were not always fondly admired. In the early modern era, women did not publish under their own names because it was seen as immodest. And later, many women wrote under pseudonyms, using initials that were gender neutral. Think J.K. Rowling in the 20th century, or using male names. Think George Sand or Acton Bell in the 19th century. But most women, if literate, didn't even have the time to write because they were busy having and raising children and tending to all that household work that seemed to be relegated to the woman. But our featured woman today found time to write even while raising 8 children and living in a primitive one-room log house. So let me tell you about Anne Bradstreet. Anne is the first woman to be recognized as an accomplished New World poet. She was born Anne Dudley on March 8th, 1612, in Northampton, England. Her father was a steward at the estate of the Earl of Lincoln, where she grew up in and among the well-stocked library of the Earl. Her father educated her because, as a Puritan, education and literacy was greatly valued. Of course, you had to be able to read the Bible. Well, in about 1628, not really sure of the date, Anne Dudley, at age 16, married Simon Bradstreet, who was assisting her father with the management of the Earl's estate in Sempringham. And she remained married to him until her death in September 1672. So she and her husband, as well as his parents, decided to immigrate to the colonies, the New World, in 1630. They originally landed in Salem, Massachusetts, Bay Colony, and moved a few times in and around the area, and finally landed in Boston, where they started their own family in 1633. And there they had 8 children between the years of 1633 and 1652. Let that sink in. It took 3 months in those days to cross the Atlantic. And then once they arrived, Anne found the conditions very sad and unexpected. There was very little food. There were fevers, malnutrition, attacks from the natives who originally occupied the colonized land. And all of them lived in the one house, one room. Now, she was a writer before she came to the New World, but she had not yet published. But even after her arrival to Massachusetts Bay Colony and starting a family, and with the heavy demands of her domestic responsibilities, she remained committed to her poetry. As I said, she was a Puritan. But what is interesting here is that we get a glimpse into her ongoing conflict experienced as a woman writer and as a Puritan. Throughout her life, Bradstreet was concerned with the issues of sin and redemption, physical and emotional frailty, death and immortality. How could she not be with that gruesome journey across the Atlantic? A lot of people didn't make it. And then getting to these desperate conditions, right? She wrote about the events that shaped her life. And thus we know what this life was like. She captured culture change, and we'll read about a little later. She wrote about the reign of Queen Elizabeth's monarchy. Much of her work indicates that she had a difficult time resolving the conflict she experienced between the pleasures of sensory and familial experience and the promises of heaven. And as a Puritan, she struggled to subdue her attachment to the world. But as a woman, she sometimes felt more strongly connected to her husband, children, and community than to God. Her writing captures her intersectionality and makes her a complete human. So, let's talk about her work. As a woman, she was expected to downplay her ambitions and did not intend to get her work published. Or maybe she did, but she had to be a little bit coy about it. In any case, it was her brother-in-law that ensured that her poems got published. He took or was given a copy of her poems to England, and it got published there, making her the first woman poet to be published in both the New World and in England. Anne Bradstreet's first book of poetry is called The 10th Muse Lately Sprung Up in America. It was published in 1650. That is 20 years after she arrived in the colonies. Some poems in this collection, especially the 4 monarchies, are regarded to be epic by critics. Within this collection, she expressed her longing for her former life in England. She ponders the wasted lives coming to the New World. As I said, so many had died either getting here or after arrival. And her desire to live long rather than pine for a life in heaven was honest in her writing, because she liked her earthly pleasures. In writing about coming to the colonies, she admitted that, quote, her heart rose in protest, really, against the New World and new manners. I mean, can you imagine? England, and London especially, was a real city. And she was coming to the backwoods here, in the colonies. So although she ostensibly reconciled herself to the Puritan mission, she wrote that she submitted to it and joined the church at Boston. And she remained ambivalent about the issues of salvation and redemption for most of her life. I admire her for actually penning that, for actually being honest with herself, introspective enough, and writing about it. That's how she worked through those conflicting feelings. Among the significant poems in the first edition of the 10th Muse, Anne reveals her personal feelings in a poem called In Honor of That High and Mighty Princess Queen Elizabeth of Happy Memory. She wrote that in 1643. And here she praises the queen as a paragon of female prowess and chides her male readers for trivializing women. And she refers to the queen's outstanding leadership and historical prominence. I mean, really, this is outspoken stuff in the 1600s, right? Now, in a personal caveat, underscoring her own dislike of patriarchal arrogance, she points out that women were not always devalued. Let me read a little bit. Nay, masculines, you have thus taxed us long, but she, though dead, will vindicate our wrong. Let such as say our sex is void of reason know 'tis a slander now, but once was treason. Her portrait of Elizabeth does not attempt to conceal her confidence in the abilities of women. She goes on to write, who was so good, so just, so learned, so wise, from all the kings on earth she won the prize. Nor say I more than duly is her due. Millions will testify that this is true. She has wiped off the aspersion of her sex that women wisdom lack to play the wrecks. This praise for Queen Elizabeth expresses Bradstreet's conviction that women should not be subordinated to men. Certainly it was less stressful to make this statement in a historic context than it would have been to confidently proclaim the worth of her own work. She wrote many short and lyric in the style that I've just read. But she also wrote long poems, such as The Four Elements, which discussed the virtues of the four classical elements of earth, air, fire, and water. And she wrote a similarly structured poem on the four seasons of the year. One of her highly regarded long poems is Contemplations, a meditation on man's place in the world, and a poem which reflects Bradstreet's Puritan background. The poem begins with a walk through New England, which inspires her meditations on nature. And she often wrote poems that spoke of her love for her husband. In To My Dear and Loving Husband, perhaps Bradstreet's most widely anthologized poem, she pays tribute to her husband and the love they shared together. It goes like this. If ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye woman, if you can. She's basically saying, I'm the happiest woman alive, and I don't think any other woman could compare to me by my husband, right? Anne only lived to be 60. She died of consumption, which we know to be tuberculosis. And she was often ill during her lifetime. She wrote about that too. So here's another fun fact about the life and legacy of Anne. For so many years, her poetry went dormant. She was better known as the daughter of Governor Thomas Dudley and husband Simon Bradstreet. Both were founders of what is now Harvard University. And her two sons graduated from Harvard as well. I saw it written of this association that in those early days, the instruction was so primitive at Harvard that she, having been able to read the Latin and French, and had, this writer said, I should think, all the prerequisites for admission to Harvard College, except gender. Unfortunately, it was male only. I think she could have done better than any one of those students there in her day. Well, in fact, any women who sought to use her wit, charm, or intelligence in the community at large might have found herself ridiculed, banished, or even executed by the colony's powerful group of male leaders. So she took great risk in doing all of this writing. These were the days of the witch trials, banishment, exile. We've seen that with other women in this series. She was supposed to be relegated to the domestic sphere only. So for 200 years, her poetry was generally ignored until it was rediscovered by feminists in the 20th century. In the mid-20th century, her poems, her voice came back into the canon. And now her works have survived the test of time, and you will find them in the Norton Anthology of Women in Literature, which is one of the ways I discovered her in college. In 1997, there was a new gate that replaced an old section of chain link fence called the Bradstreet Gate in her honor. It was designed by architect Michael S. Teller, and it was installed in 1995 as part of a multi-year effort to restore and complete the brick and ironwork fence that enclosed the entire Harvard yard. Her home used to be in that area. This gate was dedicated on October 4th, 1997, to commemorate the 25th anniversary of women living in yard dormitories. And a plaque now is attached with a line from one of Anne's poems next to the gate. I believe that we should look no further than Anne Bradstreet for a role model of ambition, grit, bravery, and a desire for love and long life. Anne wanted it all. And guess what? She managed to have it all. And she told us all about all of it. Her words speak to us today, 350 years later. That is staying power. As I said, she's in the Anthology of Women's Writing now, and you can read her poetry online at thepoetryfoundation.org. I just want to tell you this. If she could find time to write while raising babies without a modern washer and dryer, no Pampers, no baby wipes, no indoor plumbing or running water, no Grubhub, you get the idea, right? So can you. You can do whatever it is you have a passion for. And if you happen to be 60 years old right now, remember, she only lived to be 60 years old. We live so much longer. We live so much healthier. We lived through a pandemic, people. So never even think that it's too late. Today's the day. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't, that you shouldn't, that you don't have time. You do. So I encourage you to take her inspiration and put it to work in your lives today. Don't let her efforts, her words, be spent in vain. Thank you for joining me for yet another exciting, I hope for you, episode of HerStance. I'll see you next time.